In this episode, I chat with Douglas Tsoi, founder of the School of Financial Freedom, a unique program dedicated to helping people achieve financial independence while exploring the deeper meanings behind money, life purpose, and community. Douglas brings a rich background to his work, having shifted from a high-earning career as a corporate lawyer to living on just $20,000 a year for 2 decades, a choice that allowed him to achieve financial independence and focus on the things that matter most to him. Beyond his financial expertise, Douglas has also become a Franciscan spiritual director and founded the Portland Underground Grad School, where he brings people together to learn, connect, and build meaningful lives. Our conversation takes us through key insights on rethinking what it means to have enough, the importance of ethical consumption, and how financial freedom can be a gateway to a life filled with purpose, joy, and community. Douglas's perspective is especially meaningful for those of us who resonate deeply with our values and seek alignment between our financial choices and inner world. We touch on the emotional consequences of capitalism and the societal pressures that keep us feeling like we're never enough, exploring ways to break free from these cycles. We also dive into his innovative Jubilee Fund, a community project that merges debt relief with reparations, offering a powerful real life example of how money can serve a greater purpose. Whether you're on your journey to financial independence or seeking a more value centered approach to wealth, Douglas's insights invite us to look at our relationship with money through a new lens, one that emphasizes personal integrity, connection, and the freedom to pursue what truly brings us peace. Welcome, Douglas, to Highly Sensitive Money. Thanks for your time. Thanks for coming.
Yeah, thank you for having me. It's nice to see you.
Yeah, nice to see you too. And I love getting started with asking people what they do now and how does that connect to the financial background of their childhood?
Well, that's an interesting question. I teach a course called Financial Freedom. I run a little online program called the School of Financial Freedom, and it's closely connected to the FIRE movement, which is financial independence, retiring early. So I sort of help people take control of their finances to figure out what they really want to do with their lives. But it's not only just, the financial independence part, but it's more the deeper issues of why we spend, why we tend to overwork, and what do we actually really want to do. So we do that, and then I write a Substack newsletter called Money and Meaning, which is an intersection of personal finance and spirituality.
Yeah. So with the first part of FIRE, right? Financial independence, retire early. I remember hearing in one of your other interviews that money solves money problems, but nothing else.
Yeah.
It sounds like you're helping people with that intersection, right? They're like, oh, I'm finally financially independent. And then there's still life.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because in many ways, I think money can be excuse not to look at other things in your life. And then so when you finally take control of your finances, the other things that you haven't addressed and haven't looked at become more prominent. You just can't escape them anymore. And so, some people can see it as something to avoid, but it's also just an opportunity to see what is actually really going on.
And do you think everybody has that inner longing? I feel like not everyone does. I think there's like a subset of people who want to know more about like, why am I here? What am I doing? Is this useful? And then there's a lot of people who are just like, oh, those questions don't seem interesting to them.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny because my best friend is someone who is just happy. He is at ease in the world and nothing really bothers him. Like, bad things happen and he's sad and it doesn't really affect him as much. But I'm not one of those people. I don't know if you are.
No, I definitely like anything happens and I start to look at all of the potential connections. I mean, this podcast is for people who identify as highly sensitive, right? And
Right.
one of the like main telltales of that is that like everything is just more complex. Like I often with a lot of my friends who are also highly sensitive, it's just like the verbal processing that I need to make a decision. I don't take that to everyone.
Yeah, it's funny because, with my best friend, I actually do take most things to him. But oftentimes I find it like things are a lot easier than I make it out to be.
Hmm.
Yeah, it's this paradox, and I don't know if you've explored it with other guests, and I don't know if you agree or not, but sometimes, I mean, I feel like feelings are both valid and they are not the total truth, right? So there's both a danger of ignoring your feelings and, on the other hand, being directed by your feelings.
Oh, it's true. It's kind of a paradox, right? Like you have to be aware of them and at the same time maybe know where they come from. Are they like a response to a situation from a long time ago? Are they a habit, right? Are you just
Mm,
habituated to responding in this way?
mm,
Are they actually about, are you hungry? Did you not have enough
mhm,
sleep?
mhm, mhm.
So many of the times it's like the basics of, I don't know, do you need some sunshine? Do you need some socialization? Are you stressed about, do you need to renegotiate a deadline? I feel like feelings are more red herrings, but they also sometimes just need to be felt. And having the time and space to like feel them all, not everybody has that or wants that. I know that I really enjoy it though, and that's one of the things that like when I read your Substack, Money and Meaning, it feels like you've done so much inner work to get to where you're at. You've also worked with so many people on their own money journey. But I don't, yeah. So going back to your question, do I feel that feelings are the only truth? No, I think they're part of it. There's so many different components to us.
Yeah, it's funny. I come from an immigrant background, and I think you do too.
Mm.
And one of the things I think a lot about is the level of privilege it takes to to like actually feel your feelings. Like, you know, when the previous generations didn't, I think, actually had to close off of their feelings. Like I look at my parents or my grandparents and probably earlier generations, right? Society, at least Chinese society, and I suspect American society was too. I don't know about Mexican society, but pretty repressive. And it only gets to a certain level of education and privilege where you actually begin to like be able to look inward and see how you feel and see if you are able to change it.
Right. So we end up having a society right now that feels like it's mostly trying to figure out, am I okay by like net worth, right? Or status or like
Mhm,
outward social strappings. And yes, I know that. I mean, it's interesting that feeling our feelings can be a privilege. I just finished reading David Graeber's The Dawn of Everything. And I
mhm,
remember one of the times that you and I had a conversation before, we talked about David Graeber's debt, right? And like the many ways that society's been set up. And in The Dawn of Everything, one of the things he's saying is that like centuries ago, people did sit around like feeling their feelings and talking things through. Like maybe that's more of a human need than we give. But I feel like for me at least, it's a huge need. And I've figured out how to set up my life where I have the space for that. And I look at earlier generations in my family, and either it's not a need or they've repressed it. But I don't see that in them. So maybe there is a level of privilege that I now have, or maybe I'm different, or maybe it's both, right? Or
mm,
maybe because of my privilege, I'm able to open that up at all.
mhm. That's beautiful. Yeah.
Well, you started off with you shared what you do today. I'd also love to hear, and we shared a little bit about your background, right? Coming from an immigrant household, a Chinese household. How do you see, if at all, the financial background of your childhood affect the work that you do today? And I'd love to hear about the financial background of your childhood, whatever you're comfortable sharing.
Yeah. It's a super interesting question of how it affects me and what I do today because, I came from an immigrant background. My parents, my family, both sides of the family fled the communists in China, lost basically everything, went to Hong Kong, and then they eventually immigrated to Canada and the United States. And so I think there's money trauma in my family history, and that is cause for me, and interestingly enough, not for everyone in the family, but a sense of money vigilance and scarcity. So, and again, it's really interesting because you think it's causal, right? Like this family trauma happened, and because of that, I do this thing. But I actually look at cousins or other, and they have the same family history, but they've reacted completely differently. Um, so, but for me, I think the story is when I graduated from college, I got a job at the Justice Department in Washington, D.C., and I made $25,000 a year and I spent 15, and I felt rich because in college, I was actually pretty poor. I lived on $5,000 a year. And so that first year after college, spending $15,000 was literally 3 times more than I had spent the year before. And so I don't know how I did it, but at age 22, I just decided if this was enough, and enough is an important word for me, financially, spiritually, environmentally, if this was enough, I was just drawing the line right here and not spending more. And so for the next 20 years, I lived on about $25,000 a year and saved it and invested everything else. And then at 42, I got laid off and realized I just didn't have to work anymore. I had created enough passive income not to have to essentially, in terms of the fire language, sell my time for people's money.
Yeah, and you mentioned 2 terms, money vigilance, money scarcity.
Yeah.
Can you elaborate more on those for people who may not be familiar?
Yeah, there's this really great concept called money scripts, and scripts are, these are literally the life stories you tell, right? Yourself and about money. One of my heroes, Lynn Twist, calls them life sentences. And for me, money vigilance, which was one of the money scripts, is this belief that money is scarce. It could go any way, anytime. So you have to save, you have to pay attention, you have to be careful. And so I think it's really interesting. Like, there are other money scripts like money status or money worship, where spending money feels good because it makes you feel bigger. And for me, because of my money script, uh, money vigilance, spending money felt like I was giving away security. So it's interesting. I always teach in my class that in the end, the math is just the math. But on a deeper level, you can't actually do the math until you understand what's happening inside of you.
Yeah, I love that because a lot of the times we have a reason we wanna do something, and then we'll create a reason that makes that
Yes, yeah,
logical. Right.
yeah. We justify things all the time.
When you're talking about the immigrant background, I wonder how much more prevalent money scarcity is in that background. Because I think of, like, self-selection, like, who decided to move to a different country, who was able to put the resources together to even move,
Yeah.
and there's always so much, like, specific cultural messaging around money. I can't imagine what it must have been like for your family to have lost everything when communism was taking over the country. Did you grow up hearing about that, or did you hear about that more than your cousins?
You know, that's a great question. I literally don't know. But that's what I mean. Like, I have cousins who are, uh, you know, I- yeah, I have cousins who have like nice handbags, like a collection of super nice $2,000 handbags, right? Like, and so, the quote trauma of losing everything manifested completely differently for them. So there's some individualization involved here too.
There's this really interesting book called Scarcity, Why Having Too Little Means So Much. Are you familiar
Mm,
with it?
no, tell
It was
say
written
say
by
more.
2 Yeah, it was written by 2 psychologists. I can't remember their names right now, but they say that often when you grow up in an environment of, like, there isn't enough consistently, like, sometimes there is, sometimes there isn't, and this could be money, attention, food, our body responds differently, like, we respond differently, and some people respond by, as soon as they get whatever it was that they wanted, they completely use it up, or as soon as they get it, they hoard it, right?
Mhm.
But they're both kind of unconscious responses, right? So that could be sometimes, like, a very crass way of thinking about it is, like, some people have, like, money diarrhea, like they can't actually keep it. They immediately let it flow out. And some people are constipated with it,
That's
right?
yeah,
And they're hoarding it,
amazing.
but neither is, like, true balance, like complete, like, living more in circulation. And so you talked about, like, investing so much of your wealth from your income when you were young. Do you ever think about the impact of the investments on the environment, on society? Did you, like, screen anything out for private prisons? What was that even available when you started?
No, and to be honest, I actually don't do a lot of that, and I think this is part of the money script. I'm actually much more interested also environmentally. I worked as a sustainability officer for the government, I'm much more interested in consumption. And so I spend a lot of time thinking about the ethics of my consumption more than I do about my investing.
Hmm. Yeah, ethics of consumption. And that's interesting. I work as an investment manager in addition to doing money coaching. So I spend a lot of time thinking about the ethics of investing and how to put money to work in places that's supportive to what people want to see.
I could be wrong, and I'd actually be curious your opinion. So, like when you invest in a company, let's say you invest in Exxon, you buy Exxon stock, you're not actually giving Exxon money because you've just, unless it's actually from a new offering from the company, but you're actually buying shares from someone else. Um, and so Exxon is not actually directly benefiting from you buying a share from it. On the other hand, when you buy gas or for your car or when you get on a plane, Exxon is actually literally directly benefiting from your purchase. And I think it's a lot easier. This is my belief. It's a lot easier for progressive people to think about like, oh, I don't want to invest in this. And actually, I find a lot of people who are progressive that have their own money traumas just simply don't invest because, again, they justify it by saying like the system is dirty, which is true. But most people that I know don't actually say, I'm not going to drive or I'm not going to get on a plane.
They may decide, I mean, there may be some guilt. I know when I was a digital nomad and I was traveling all the time, I like considered buying the carbon offsets, but I have distrust of those agencies. I'm
Hmm.
like, how much of it really was
Yeah.
effective that I never really did, right?
Yeah.
And sometimes I wonder when I'm making these decisions around cost benefits, like how much of it is my money scarcity, my money vigilance, or how much of it is, and again, we justify everything, so it's hard to
Yeah.
know what my true thing is.
Yeah. And I totally agree with you. And I think for me, one of the things I try and tell people is we are much more comfortable with our identities as consumers in capitalism than we are with investors. But functionally, that's a massive problem because capitalism relies on our consumption more than it does our investing.
Hmm. And you have a really interesting course called The Emotional Consequences of Capitalism. In your website, you write that capitalism creates two feelings in you: never having enough and never being enough. The first is the hamster wheel of consumption, and the second is the hamster wheel of achievement and performative display. I feel that with consumption, it's pretty intuitive for me to understand what that means. Like people wanting to like consume to kind of fill a void. Like if I have the new handbag, if I have a new trip, like maybe I'll feel better. Is that directly also related to the to the hamster wheel of achievement and performative display? Like how do you define these separately?
Yeah, I think about, the idea that I don't have enough is as part of the overall consumption that we do. Like, for example, we we consume the average American, I don't know the Mexican, but the average American buys 8 pairs of shoes a year. We consume 4 times more clothes than we did in the year 2000. We basically consume twice as much as we did 20 years ago, like across the board. And my question is like, why are we buying 8 pairs of shoes a year? Like, does that mean we're filling up our closets, or are we throwing away 8 pairs of shoes a year? Um, and so this sense of like I don't have enough is not only never ending, but it is accelerating over time, right? But on the flip side of it, this idea that I'm not enough is what creates achievement culture, our exhaustion. I call it workism, right? Like, we're constantly trying to do better all the time. We're always trying to achieve, we're always trying to show uh, that we're good. And, that to me directly contradicts this whole idea of grace. We're constantly trying to earn our okayness. And the Christian concept of grace is that you deserve to be here, and there's nothing you can do more or nothing you can do less for that.
Do you go into Max Weber's The Protestant Work Ethic into that work, or are you familiar with it?
I'm familiar with it, but like I find it super confusing. So like I haven't touched it because yeah, I feel like Yeah, I mean, the Protestant work ethic, my understanding of it is that, the more you have, the more that you're seen as blessed by God. But that to me is like super confusing and doesn't make any sense.
It's like the prosperity gospel of if you are doing well, you must have been blessed, and then you might have a place in heaven, right? So then you want to do as well as possible to prove that you've been blessed, but it's very like a circular reasoning. And I don't remember exactly like all the reasons of why this came about when it came about, but that it's so you're starting from a philosophical place of like we already have grace, like because we're here, things are already enough, and that's not where a lot of people move from, right? That's not what motivates them. For the people that come to you, what are the ways that you help them, I guess, disentangle the feeling of not being enough and not having enough? And what do you replace it with?
People who come to me, especially for coaching, I mean, because I have it on the website, that is a question they come in with.
Hmm.
Actually, I have a close friend who, even before I became a teacher of personal finance or a money coach, he asked me this 20 years ago, and it's sort of the animating question for all the work I do. He asked, "What is enough?" Right? Like he's not only asking in terms of like the size of his home, but also like how much achievement is enough, right? Like, and interestingly enough, he's now the head of a major organization. Um, and um, again, my mentor, Lynn Twish, when you always want more, enough is never enough. And
Hmm.
so there's this internal inquiry that has to happen of like, why do I always want more?
An internal inquiry of why do I want more? What is motivating it? One of the questions that's come to me recently is for people who have made it income wise, like they have a really strong income and they have family in other parts of the world that they're supporting. They have parents that they're supporting. What any recommendations for people in that situation? Because maybe they want to have enough, but they also feel this sense of obligation towards others.
Yeah, I think that's beautiful. I don't know what advice I'd give them. I don't know what the specific question they're struggling with, but I feel like who do we belong to is one of the major questions that we all should be asking. And I feel in America, we have this belief like we belong to ourselves, right? Like we're individuals and we're responsible for ourselves. And I think, you know, that is not the traditional cultural belief. In most traditional cultures, we belong to each other. We belong to our families mostly, right? And to support other families is an honor and it's a duty. I think, in ancestral cultures, we belong to the world too. And I think the further we move away from this idea that we belong to each other and we belong to this earth, the more individualistic we get, the easier it is just to consume for ourselves and to keep on working for that.
Hmm. So maybe when someone is saying, "Okay, I'm going to take this job that maybe is not fully aligned, or I'm not going to rest as much as I would like to because I have these, because I want to be able to support for other people in other parts of the world." And then they're also juggling saving for their own retirement, saving for the fact that there's not a true safety net in the US. You talked about the issue of workism. So when somebody is deciding, like, yes, I will work until I'm 65, 70, making as much money as possible, staying in corporate America because I'm providing for these other people, how how would you recommend that they balance that, not getting too far off into workism as like work being their only identity?
Well, I honestly, I think they would know better than I, but I think part of the answer is, my newsletter is called Money and Meaning, and the meaning of what you do matters just as much as what you do, right? So, like, if if the meaning of you earning a high income is that you can own a bigger house and you can buy a nicer car, I think inherently there's something empty about that. But if you are working really hard, earning high income in order to support other people in your lives, I think that's inherently more meaningful. I think people get more satisfaction out of that.
By definition, they're already avoiding the work as identity trap
Yeah.
that can be really empty.
That's
Yeah.
that's a beautiful way to put it. Yeah. I don't know.
And
What do you think?
Well, and you also said something right now that really stood out to me. They would know better than me. And that reminds me of the fact that you're also a spiritual director. But you asked me, what do I think? So
Yeah.
I grew up with some enabling in my family. My mother was a really high income earner, and I feel that in her giving, especially to the men in my family, they never really had that full vigor. Having my mom as like such a big safety net
Mm,
both drained her and in some way drained them because they never really were able, like one of my uncles finally did just like stop asking, but my other uncle never hasn't fully made it, right? So I feel that it's this balance of giving out of a place of desire to give with no expectations, which is something that I saw my mom struggle with. And then the other side, the person receiving, not using it as an eternal crutch.
mm,
When I'm working with people on this question, I try to help them open it up as much as possible so that if whatever they do decide to give, completely freely given. They're not sitting at the office making this high income being resentful, right? So there's a really interesting balance there of also including self-care in our equation. Like I know when I walked away from corporate America, I was walking away from being able to provide for my nieces and nephews more than I am today.
mm.
And I've decided to provide in other ways. I fly them out to Mexico City when they turn 15 for their quinceañera. They get like a
Mhm.
1 week trip with their aunt, going to museums and like other things. It's not just educational things.
Yeah.
But it was a question for me when I walked away from corporate America. I think the question itself speaks to a happier answer than to not have the question at all and just do it unconsciously, like with anything. Like the more I feel that the more deeply we decide, we truly decide, like all of us is in alignment with what we're doing, the happier it'll be.
Yeah, it's interesting. This is the thought, and it's not totally on point, but I think it's related. Like, what I hear in your story is the idea: are you enabling or disabling someone else, right? And I think about I've had financial struggles before. Like, I used to be a corporate lawyer, and then I got fired and became a Quaker school teacher. And moving from $150,000 a year to $35,000 a year was a major shift. Luckily, I was only spending $20,000 a year, so I could make that shift. Those are the most important things that have happened to me, right? And sometimes we take away other people's pain. Pain is actually the signal that we need to actually live differently.
Mhm.
And I got fired as a lawyer, and I'm super grateful, right? I w- it was a super uncomfortable, painful period, and without that, I wouldn't have become who I became.
Yeah, and sometimes those, like, early trials when we're younger and I mean, I decided to become an entrepreneur when my mom allowed me to, like, move into her home, like, I
Mhm.
had my cash safety net, I had housing covered, and that gave me enough strength to do it, so I don't wanna say that helping others I've received help, and I've definitely helped others,
Mhm.
but there's a point where it can become toxic. And again, every relationship knows what that point is. It's very much a question between those two people.
Yeah, and I feel like I don't know, this is not totally true, but at least it's mostly true in America, like, there is a safety net for failure in America, like, compared to, like, historically, like, very few people starve in America, and, starvation was something that happened historically all the time. We have abilities to make mistakes and, like, to get back on our feet, and, thankfully, with the help of our family, including my family, and so, paradoxically, I actually think we have more chances to fail, and we have more ability to take risks now than we ever have in history.
Hmm. It's interesting. And it's again going back to what is the story that we tell ourselves? Is it a story that's empowering or not? Yeah.
Yeah,
And you meant
no, as you point out, and how do we empower? or disempower other people too, which I think is such a interesting, important issue within families.
Hmm. Right. And part of the, like when you mentioned going from being a corporate lawyer to then being a Quaker school teacher, I'm imagining you didn't have like children to provide for or like other
Right.
external, right?
Right.
Yeah. That
Hmm.
also gives you a lot of flexibility. So you're the first Quaker guest that I have on this podcast. I also am Quaker. When did you like? I just want to dive into that. I know it's not as related to money, but it's definitely related to meaning. When did you come into contact with Quakers? Do you go to a Quaker meeting in Portland?
Portland. So I became Quaker actually after that firing as a lawyer. And I was just reading. Well, after I got fired as a lawyer, I was thinking of going back to business school or back to school for business school. And I was reading this book at the library called Essays That Get You into Business School. Because for business school, you have to write like 8 different essays per business school because they want to see how you write and how you think and who you are. And there was this essay from this Quaker woman talking about how her Quaker beliefs would affect how she do business. And I just got interested in it, and I decided to go to a Quaker meeting. And the first Quaker meeting I went to, I just felt like I had been Quaker all my life, and I had never known they existed. Just sitting in silence with other people, just waiting to hear what messages people received from the spirit, as they say in Quakers. Just I felt totally at home, and over a series of, I'd say, 2 or 3 months of sitting in Quaker meeting, that was my first authentic spiritual experience. And I just realized, I don't know if I could teach, but if I didn't try teaching at a Quaker school, I'd never feel right. So I didn't go to business school,
Mm.
and I volunteered for a year at a Quaker boarding school. They provided me room and board, and then I got a job there the year after.
Wow, what a huge that's a huge fork in the road from business
Yeah,
school,
yeah,
Quaker school.
and that's part of the story. Like if I always say like, well, how do I put this? Lawyers statistically are some of the most unhappy people in the world. Like the lawyering profession is statistically one of the least satisfied professions. Or to put it more personally, I know a lot of people who went to law school because they're my law school classmates, and no one wants their kid to be a lawyer. And so, how do I put this? Like, I was not a very good lawyer. I was not good at it. I wasn't really interested in it. And I'm super grateful for that failure because if I was good at it and disliked it, I'd be a successful, miserable lawyer right now. And I know a lot of successful, miserable lawyers. And so, I had the privilege. I didn't have a family to take care of. And I know a lot of my friends who are successful, miserable lawyers have families. And perhaps, that goes back to the issue of meaning, right? They're able to do their jobs willingly because it provides for their families. But for me, I had the opportunity to do something different because of the failure.
Yeah. Similarly, when I was considering doing what I do now, I had to think of the reasons why I wouldn't do it. And like I had very few reasons. Had no one that relied on me. I had no debt. I had no mortgage. And sometimes there's this when you have more outward reasons to like stay on the path that you're on, there might just be less questioning that happens. But when you don't have those reasons, again, you have to be really confident of why you're choosing to stay on that path.
Yeah.
So now switching over to social justice, tell me about like how you understand social justice and how you incorporate it into your work as working with people in fire and in other capacities.
Yeah. I mean, social justice is super, you know, it's a very broad term. And as you mentioned, I work as a spiritual director as well. I
Hmm.
got trained as a spiritual director during the pandemic by the Franciscans. And one of the Franciscans has this beautiful term for the spiritual path, which is oneing.
Mm.
And I think, religions all around the world have this whole idea of like, how do we become one, right? And that is sort of the mystical spiritual path. And that's how that's a lens I use for for social justice. This idea of like, how do I let go of my egocentric desires and become one with all, right? Like there's a pretty famous a Buddhist meditation teacher who said, all spirituality is intimacy with all things. And so, capitalism and, you know, individualism says I am an individual unit, separate and at arm's length from all things. And I think all spirituality just trying to get you towards is unity with all things. So that's the lens I have for social justice.
This idea of social justice as oneness with all things, interconnectedness across all of us, is that part of your core teachings at the School of Financial Freedom?
Oh, that's a super interesting question. Well, no, because I would say that, I started teaching FIRE, which is quite frankly a very individualistic endeavor before I started getting into social justice and spirituality, which quite frankly happened because I had the freedom to like stop worrying about my own personal finances. One metaphor that I really like, or one framework I really like, is like, you first have to take care of yourself. You have to first be able to take care of yourself before you can take care of others. And I think me becoming financially independent when I was 42 allowed me to actually start thinking about my dharma and what other things I want to do for others, um, with freedom. So yeah, I mean, the things that I've done since are not directly related to my financial freedom course. I mean, the financial freedom course is, you know, mostly for people who haven't, well, it is for people who haven't attained the independence from capitalism that they would need to do whatever they wanted. But my
Mhm.
projects afterwards are about how do we like help people tear down the boundaries of, their individual egos and be closer to each other.
Mhm. I listened to a really great interview that you did on the Earn Invest podcast, and it was with Vicki Robbins. And the
Mhm.
question that the host was asking, should financial independence come with a warning label? Right. And it very much relates to, okay, I answered my own individual needs and I have like another 50 years.
Yeah.
What do I do with this one precious life, to quote Mary Oliver?
I think financial independence is the how, but the the thing that comes afterwards is the why and the what. What are you gonna do? What is the why that animates your life? Um, and I think if you continue doing the same thing, I know people who are like mathematically financially independent, right? Like they don't actually have to work another day of their lives, and they keep on doing the same thing that they're doing. Um, I think on some level, I hate this is my own judgment, but that's sort of a waste. Like you have an opportunity to do something completely different. And I would say that my life is not only, how do I put this, like just because like you're financially independent and like you don't have to work for money anymore, doesn't mean like you have to like devote your life to like the good of all. Like the vast majority of my time, since I don't work, is actually spent doing things I enjoy. Um, like I wrote extensively this summer a series of posts about doing nothing because
Mm,
on some level, the social justice movement falls in the same sort of um, ideology as capitalism. Like there has to be more and more and more. There's not enough. And at some point you have to be able to balance that with like gratitude and grace for what is. And so like I spent a ton of my time doing like the typical Sabbath things, which are just like relaxing, going on walks with my dog, eating with friends. I wrote a post about what someone else termed, Cal Newport termed, analog leisure. So, you know, doing things that have no connection to digital devices. So, like, I've started playing guitar and piano, playing soccer, all these things. And I think one of the privileges of this life is like to even just let go of having to help others and just be.
yeah, I remember reading one of your posts about leisure in groups, that you went to like a jam session and that was like a really big sense of community. A lot of the times for most people, like there's no space to do that, right? It feels like it's such a privilege to do that. And yet, if you had lower economic needs, lower financial needs, you would have more time to choose to use that way.
Being in community, singing, dancing, playing music together is one of those primary satisfactions that, that we talked about before. Francis Weller talks about the difference between primary satisfactions and secondary satisfactions. And I believe most of those Sabbath activities and most of those analog leisure activities are primary satisfactions.
Hmm. Well, there's Trisha Hershey who wrote The Net Ministry,
Hmm.
right? Like about how counterintuitive or how revolutionary it is to be well rested. And Adrienne Marie Brown, she talks about pleasure activism of like having joy be a main part of your social justice work. But I know for myself, as someone who's struggled with codependence and overgiving and then martyrdom, like that's definitely part of my social justice background or history. I had to learn to put myself as part of the community, right? My well being is an integral part of the community because I am part of the community. Like, I want the community to do well. It's very much that Mobius strip of what's outside affects the inside, what's inside affects the outside. And it kind of gets rid of that because the term social justice can sometimes create a dichotomy between like this is good, this is bad. Like a lot of
Hmm.
progressive thinking can create that dichotomy, and it's really not that black or white, or there is no separation. Going back to what you were saying about the spiritual path being one of wanting or of oneness. Yeah, that's beautiful. One of the things that I hear is that people will come to the School of Financial Freedom focusing on financial independence. But if they're focusing on the meaning part of your work, they can go to spiritual directionship. They can go to even the second course, the emotional consequences of capitalism. That's already opening up the second part of this conversation, right? I saw that the course, the emotional consequences of capitalism, is set up with like readings, solo work with other people. Can you talk a little bit about the cadence of that and how you thought it up? What made you want to teach that way?
Yeah, I created that course, which is now called the Money and Meaning, during the pandemic when we were all like separate. And so my mission in life is to help people learn and feel closer to their communities. And, during the pandemic when we were all isolated in our own homes, I was trying to figure out how do I help people use learning as a way to connect to each other. So, and I knew that like everyone was spending too much time on the computer and on Zoom. So that was just one of the major constraints that I put on myself. Like was not going to create a course that required people to spend a lot of time in front of a computer. So it's an 8-week course, and actually, uh, the new cohort just started this week, and it's designed around a short essay by me, like five minutes long, maybe, um, where you read it, and then there's some instructions, and you find a partner in the class and you go on an hour-long walk and talk with them. So, like, on the phone, you just walk and you have a conversation with someone. Um, and then sometime during that week, you just write a short 1 or 2 paragraph reflection, what you discovered. So, the whole idea is to increase your own sense of presence in the world. And I think it's interesting, one of my current students, she's a pretty serious meditator, and she says that when we're on our devices, like us right now, we actually stop breathing. Yeah, like
Oh.
we hold our breaths when we're online. We become disembodied. And so the idea of we're just not fully present when we're online. Um, and so I wanted to create a way for people to actually breathe while they were learning.
Wow, that's so interesting. I had not heard that we stop breathing when we're on our devices. I know that I recently got a dog maybe a year ago,
Mm,
and going on a walk with her, I now have this practice of like, are you breathing, Deanna? Like, have you remembered? Sometimes my breaths are so shallow.
yes.
And
Yeah.
I've combined the walking with the like intentional breathing. Okay. And I love that. You were thinking about like, what does my community need? What are the people that might benefit from this need? And they need time away from their screen. So the money and meaning course, as it's now called. Okay. Yeah, that's beautiful. Thanks for creating that. I'll be happy to share that. And you said that a lot of your work is focused on creating more of a community. Why? How is that part of your why?
I think, I mean, at least my experience, and I think for most people, their why comes from their own need. And, I grew up as a single child. I didn't grow up with my mom and dad. So I think I spent a ton of time, again, they both work. So I spent a ton of time by myself with, no siblings, parents both working. And so my own need for community is part of I loved school because I was around other people and I was extrovert. Um, and so I think that was the combination of the learning and community. I loved being with other people and I loved learning.
That's beautiful that a lot of the times your why comes from your own need, right? So that goes
Yeah.
back to hearing yourself, putting on your own oxygen mask before
Yeah.
then trying to put it
Oh
on
yeah.
for other
That's
people.
beautiful. Yeah. Can you articulate your own mission and how it's connected to your need?
I don't think as clearly. I think a lot about like the suffering that money creates
Mm.
and wanting to help that. And part of my money story is like being the children of immigrants, I was also lucky enough that I got back. I was able to go back to Mexico all the time. We lived on the border. So we would go to Mexico to the grocery store to visit my grandmother, to have Chinese food. Like everything was in Mexico as far as I could tell because I grew up in a tiny agricultural town. And when I would visit my cousins, I could tell I had the new shoes. I had the spending money. And I felt as an 8-year old, 9-year old, I felt like a sense of guilt around
Mm.
that. Like, why
Mhm.
do I have it when you don't? And my need is like, I don't know, I would love to live in a world where everybody had their needs met. I
Mm.
I recently heard that Oscar Wilde was a socialist, not because he like was thinking of the well-being of everyone, but because he just didn't like seeing poor people. He didn't want to see anyone homeless. I have this need to just like again, there was someone I walked by someone yesterday who's homeless and who didn't it's cold here in Mexico City. It's 60 degrees, which by my standards and the city standards is cold. And he didn't have a sweater. And I was thinking, do I have anything I can give him? And then when on my way back, I saw that he had a couple of jackets. So somebody showed up and like gave him
Okay.
something to be warm. But it's this very like physical need of I don't want anyone to not be well.
Mm. Yeah, 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 yeah. Well, that's beautiful because, I mean, I think a lot of people have that desire, but what they do is they turn away and you turn towards.
To the best of my ability. And it's still very much an open conversation,
Yeah.
right? Well, I want to end on one of the things that I found of your work that I really, really loved was the Jubilee Fund.
Mhm.
And what I know about Jubilee funds is that in some societies hundreds of years ago, they would they would kind of clear out the debts for the year, right? So kind of like it's I don't know, it's winter solstice. Let's everyone feast. Whatever you owe, you don't owe it anymore. That's
Yeah.
kind of where I hear the origin is. How did you bring that into your community? How did you make that a reality in the 21st century?
Yeah, the whole idea of the Jubilee Fund was, and it was connected to reparations. And so the idea was like I had some money I wanted to give to reparations, and at the same time, um, I had some friends who were in debt. And so I just came up with this idea that instead of me giving to reparations, I would pay off the debt of my friends and just ask him and his wife to, over a period of time, send the money at 0% interest to reparations over time. And so I just gathered a bunch of friends together and we collected over $100,000. And we found, I think, 8 people who had credit card debt, and credit card debt's like 20%, 25% interest. And we paid off all their credit card debt. And those people who we call donors, they agreed to pay back the original principal of their debt monthly to reparations over 5 years. And so the whole idea is we're turning debt into donations. And the money serves two purposes. It gets people out of debt and it still goes to reparations.
And was there any was there the desire to keep track of what the donors were doing with the money, or how did that work?
Yeah, we keep track. We collect the money, and part of it was we wanted to create, again, community. So we collect the money all together and then we distribute them. We gave the donors, I think, 4 or 5 different places that they could choose to give reparations to. And so we collected the money and then we distributed the money to the different reparation funds. But the idea is, and I think you'll appreciate this. Angel Kyoto Williams, she talks about, I think she said the Lakota do not have a personal possessive pronoun. And so there's no word for mine or my. So instead of my knife, it would be the knife beside me. Or instead of the house or my house, it would be like the house that I live in. But she said, if you practice that for a month, not using the word my, you'll see that language makes a huge difference. And so Ram Dass always said that if you took the word it's you took the word my away and it became the money just goes to places where it's most needed, right? And again, that's the whole idea of possessiveness and the ego. When the money is no longer, quote, mine, the money is going to go to the best places it can.
Hmm. Yeah, and again, one of the places where I tighten up with that concept is but who's going to take care of me when I can't work?
Hmm.
And that's a growing edge for me of how to both set myself up right now and also have more trust. That's such an interesting idea, though, that the possessive my can really change a community that much. And going back to the Jubilee Fund, how many years ago was that? Was it 3 or 4 years ago?
It's now 3.5 years. And so we are, and it's a pilot. And our hope is that someone with more money or a larger organization or foundation becomes interested in the idea and takes it up on a much bigger level than us. We're only 12 people and with $100,000. But the idea is that we do it for 5 years and see how much money actually got to reparations.
Hmm. Another obstacle that might come up is that people often donate for tax write-offs,
Hmm.
right? So if the Jubilee Fund is not like a 501(c)(3), it's harder for people to sometimes to say oh, I want to give to that organization.
Yeah. But my guess is if a nonprofit or foundation does it, they may be able to do it with people uh, able to get the tax deduction.
Hmm.
And I mean, quite frankly, I'm not someone who takes tax deductions for my donations. This is a personal thing, but if you're only giving away money so you can get a tax deduction, I just want to query that.
Yeah. Well, again, I work in the investment industry, and sometimes we have clients who are doing major reparations. They received an inheritance, they sold a business, and they're looking at how to offset capital gains, right? So when you sell stocks that have appreciated, all of those taxes are going towards a government that you may not be in agreement with, right? If 60% of the government's money is going towards military things, I see the positive side of wanting to get that tax write-off. At the other end, though, many people don't itemize their taxes. So it doesn't have to be a hindrance. I'm just thinking of the larger
Yeah,
organizations. And you can get fiscal sponsorship. There's always a
yeah,
way.
for sure. Yeah,
Yeah, in Spanish we say there's always siempre hay maña. There's always you could always kind of maneuver yourself around it.
yeah. There are ways that we could have done it so people could get tax deductions, but it just wasn't worth our time, my time. Like,
Mhm.
yeah. So, in short, as they say in America, if there's a will, there's a way.
Mhm. Siempre hay maña. Yeah, and I still love the concept of it, the Jubilee Fund. When I first heard it, it's so counterintuitive, and it feels like it must have been such a magical society before where that was done. And yet people did it for hundreds of years. So
Yeah.
we can bring that practice back.
Yeah.
Well, Doug, thank you so much for your time today. Thank you for your writing. I really enjoy your Substack. I hope that people listening to this are intrigued and go sign up. How else can people find you in addition to money and meaning?
Yeah. So the traditional place people can find me is my Substack, which is uh, money meaning. I think the URL is douglastsoi.substack.com. And then I have my own personal website, which is douglastsoi.com, where I talk about money coaching, spiritual direction, and gratitude practices.
Yeah. And for spiritual direction, I really enjoyed your website. It's got really clear invitation of like who this is meant for, how it's set up. So thank you.
Well, thank you.
Thank you so much for listening to this episode of Highly Sensitive Money with Douglas Tsoi. Rather than seeing wealth as an end goal, Douglas asks us to explore motivations and embrace a simpler, more intentional life full of community, rest, and meaning. I particularly love his invitation to explore the what that animates our life. If you're interested in learning more about how to approach money as a highly sensitive person, head over to my website at allthecolors.net and check out Douglas's work, which is linked in the show notes. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider rating and reviewing the podcast wherever you listen. Your feedback not only supports the show, but helps other listeners find these conversations. Stay tuned for our next episode where we'll continue diving into money, social justice, and how to make intentional choices as highly sensitive individuals. Thank you again for being here, and I look forward to connecting with you next time.